Let me welcome everybody to the Future Transform for a brand new thing that we're trying out this week. This is the first Future Transform Extra. So if you are probably all familiar with the forum, this is a weekly video conference conversation about the future of education and technology. We've been going on for a bit more than 2.5 years now. But we're trying something new this week. Every so often we have a guest who is just so brilliant and a topic that is just so engaging that we have more questions and more comments than we can really deal with in an hour. We sometimes have an overflow, and we decided this week to try and give our guest a chance at addressing those questions. So Professor Miller, who was a fantastic guest talking about her research into the science of learning, had triggered really great conversation a week and a half ago, and we wanted to pursue that. So this week we're trying the first of a Future Transform Extra. If you like this, if this session works for you, please let us know. We can keep this in mind for future sessions when we have further guests who just inspire so much conversation we can't possibly fit it into a single hour. This week, we're not going to start with an overview of the forum, where it comes from. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are already familiar with it. We're just going to dive right in. We're going to work with questions that we've archived. And those of you who are with us today, you get to add some more as we go. So let me just quickly walk you through the technology so that you feel comfortable being able to participate, and then we'll dive right in. So right now, we're here in the shinden platform, and there are a few different pieces you want to know about. So one of them is I am here on the stage, and you can see Professor Miller next to me, also on the stage. All of you can see and hear those of us on the stage. So you can see Professor Miller's coffee or tea. You can see the Vermont history books behind me, and all of that is visible for everybody. Now, below us is what I think of as the participant swarm, or the audience, or the group of people participating in this video conference. And, you can mouse over and see Tom Doonan and Gail Matthews-Natali, and that's a really great place to see an audience, but it's also an audience that can participate. And let me show you a few ways that you can participate in the conversations. Look down at the very bottom of the screen. You'll see a white strip running along it that has a few different menu options. On the left side, there are a few key buttons. So the first one, on the very left edge, there's a number, I think it's 16 now. It's got a few different heads on it, or personal outlines. And next to it is a kind of dialogue box, like for a comic strip. If you click on that, up will pop two different links. On the left side, you'll see a list of participants, like a film strip. You can just mouse over them and learn more about them. So you can see that Tom Doonan is an instructional designer at SBBC College. You can see that Doyle Frisbee is a senior fellow at the Council of Post-Secondary Education, and so on. To the right of that is a chat box, and that lets you just quickly chat to whoever is, the roughly 18 or so people who've signed in with you. Right now, it should be all of us. So you can see Val and Roxanne and Tom have all introduced themselves, and Roxanne has very kindly put in a citation and a link to Dr. Miller's book. So you can use that chat box all the time for the next hour. Now, back on that white strip, next to the chat box button is a little question mark with a circle around it that says Ask. If you click that, you can type in questions or comments that we can share. And that's what a lot of what happens during this forum is people whose microphone doesn't work or whose camera doesn't work or can't speak out loud for whatever reason, they use that to type in questions and comments. Now, next to that, oh, by the way, when you type one of those in, we can flash it on the screen so that everybody can see your text, then I'll read it out loud so people can hear it. Now, next to that, almost in the middle of the white strip, is a raised hand icon. If you click that, that tells us that you want to join us on stage. So to do that, it's really easy. If your microphone works, if your camera works, if you're in a place where you can speak out loud and you have something to say, click the raised hand and you can join us on stage. In fact, right now, between Dr. Miller and myself, there's room for 2 more people, so we can have a kind of panel as you like. So the raised hand, the question mark, the number icon, all those are different ways to participate. If you have any questions, if you have any thought, if you have any examples, if you have any pushback, those are all places where you can contribute to the conversation. That makes sense? We can jump in. And before we go further, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us. This is an experiment for us, and I'm really glad you can make time for it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm honored, and I think I had the mirror image experience of after interacting with this group last time, going, "Oh my gosh, what happened to the hour? I wish that we could do this again." And sometimes wishes come true. So thank you so much.
That's very, very kind. That's really, really kind. Well, friends, we have I have a list of questions. It's in text, and what I can do is I can read them out loud, and then Professor Miller can take a whack at each one. And these are not in any particular order, by the way. I want to keep the organic flow of them, so they're not ranked by size or priority or by topic or anything else. And Michelle, if you think that one of these questions we've already addressed it, please let me know. We can move on. As we go, you'll have your own questions. So let's dive in with this Future Transform Extra. First question is, this is from Wendy Prantner, and she asked, how would you recommend approaching professional development for faculty to help them consider cognitive psych topics in their classroom?
All right. Well, professional development for faculty. You know what, as I think we touched on last time, I think that we're in a new era of receptivity to evidence-based pedagogy of all kinds. I think cognitive psychology, unlike when I was first in graduate school, it's really kind of entered the public consciousness as well, even through the work of people like Malcolm Gladwell, who does a really good job translating the science. The translation that ends up in newspapers and magazines and blog posts isn't always, great, but people have an awareness of this. So I think that I think it's a lot easier to just kind of roll out something and say, hey, this is going to be a psychologically based or especially cognitively based development experience that we have. So I guess, first of all, I would just be optimistic about that. I think selecting some of the shorter readings, articles like that from the literature, even in the journal College Teaching, which I'm a consulting editor on, there are cognitively based articles in there which are geared to a multidisciplinary audience and not kind of just inside baseball to other psychologists. So those are some things that I would put out there, is picking the shorter readings that don't necessarily have to be popularized, or that those can be a good starting point. Some other things about there's something else I wanted to mention that I thought about when I saw faculty professional development with a cognitive kind of basis or spin on it. I do want to say that I co-facilitate a series now of online workshops, primarily 1-week workshops that are geared to faculty and instructional designers and even administrators who work in higher education. And those are through the Learning Consortium. So, full disclosure, that's one of the things that I've put together. But I've worked with a person from educational psychology named Dr. Kristen Betts, and she and I think, have great chemistry, and we've put together some pretty dynamic short courses that are explicitly about bringing neurocognitive and related sciences into our teaching. So we have those have been pretty popular. So we have one that's running at the beginning of October. I'm not on the business end of those things, so I don't know if there's spaces, but we do have that soon. And we have several more of those running next year as well. So those are some options too. I mean, with some, if you're working with people who work in this field, there are, I think, increasingly more options that aren't a whole semester long or don't require you to get involved in a whole formal program, which I don't think many of us in higher education really want to do at this point, unless we're really still developing at that point in our career. So those are some ideas.
Oh, very nice. Very nice. Very, very helpful. Wendy, thank you for a really, really good question. And down the road, if you all would like, we can pursue this with a forum. We can, obviously, I'm always happy to bring Professor Miller back. And if there's anybody else that works in this field, just let us know. Wendy had a follow-up question, which was about starting a PhD in neuroscience that would merge work and instructional design. And she wanted, do you have any recommendations for PhD programs or any recommendations for resources for professional development in neuroscience? So there's a little overlap with the first question. Let's focus on the PhD programs. Where are the hot spots in the world to go to for that?
Oh gosh, there's so many. It's so many that the top university, Stanford, UC Santa Barbara, you have active labs that are working in things like virtual reality or multimedia and the implications for instruction. That said, here I really want to qualify too. It's been some time since I've been in the swing of things, because I spend so much of my professional energy these days working directly with faculty. I'm not as involved with the graduate student component of it. But here in my my co-facilitator of the work that we do with the Online Learning Consortium, Kristen Betts, she's based at Drexel University, so that tends to to me speaks highly of the very dynamic interdisciplinary work going on there. And I'd encourage Wendy and really anybody else, if you'd like me to put you in touch with Dr. Betts, just maybe direct message me on Twitter or something like that. And she is incredibly passionate about this part. And that's one of the things that we hand off in our online short courses, as she really has made a case to me and really kind of sends that experience out on the last day or so with, okay, here are some other experiences to think about. So I'm in awe of some of the things that she knows, and so I'd put that out to a contact. But I think really when looking at any graduate school like that, I think, as many of us are increasingly aware today, I mean, it may seem obvious, but then again, this is a big commitment. So definitely look and see, what specific kinds of work are being done, and make sure that wherever you do go, wherever you do choose, that we aren't just saying that we value interdisciplinary work, that you can actually see interdisciplinary collaborations going on. I mean, old traditions die hard, and so those silos can there. So you do want to be really, really sure that you're going to be able to combine this work in the way that you want. But I think more of us are going to be wanting to do that, and it's amazing to see that the generation of people coming up in this area. So all the encouragement to folks out there for that.
Oh, that's a great answer, and thank you again, Wendy, for a really, really good question. I was going to say just go to Northern Arizona University and hang out with Michelle Miller, but I understand there are other options here. Let me switch questioners. We have a couple of questions from Patrick Melnick, and he dives into a specific question, a topic that came up a couple of times, and he says, "The issue for me isn't about multitasking and student distraction. My research has shown student distraction or lack of focus is because we don't ask students to multi-think." And he goes on, I think this is a continuation. "We don't ask students to converge separate knowledge domains to find new patterns of thought. We don't ask students to engage their 86 billion brain-connective neurons and their 700 trillion synaptic." And that's the end of it. It got cut off there. Well, what do you think about this question of multi-thinking? This is a new one for me.
Wow, and it would be really neat to see some empirical research that kind of tries to pin that down and show it developing. And it may also reflect a terminology difference. I mean, it's not who's right or who's wrong, but sometimes I really notice with the cognitive terminology that we do, depending on what discipline we're from or whether we're really heavily within cognitive psychology, we use the terms differently. So, for example, attention, distraction, focus. I mean, those are things that can reasonably mean a student's overall focus over the course of a given semester, or some very high level focus on what they want to accomplish, and that's a reasonable use of the term. But, to cognitive psychologists who are talking about this, on this really micro level, it's like how are resources being allocated, like, over the next 20 milliseconds. So we may be looking at that. I do think, it comes back to what I think we know is probably the biggest issue in any kind of thinking skills, which is transfer. And that's something that John Bransford and others have made this pretty persuasive case to show that, we assume it happens and it doesn't happen. We assume perhaps that students are making connections across courses, but we're likely overestimating that. I was just reading some journal entries yesterday for my students in a psychology of language class, and a few of them actually talked about, oh, hey, I took this thing you talked about in this class, and I'm going to use it for a paper in a different class, or I was in an everyday situation and it reminded me of this thing. And I mean, that's 2 entries out of quite a number. I mean, I notice it and I'm happy when it occurs, but it doesn't occur necessarily by default. And I think it may also come down to the very practical advice that we see in a lot of contexts to teachers. I think is very solid, which is you simply have to have students in the act of practicing the things that you want. It is just, it's so easy, even for us who are seasoned veterans of this, it's so easy to say, okay, I'm going to present this thing, I'm going to present that thing, and it'll come together at the end, and students will see the connections, and they'll apply it in their lives and in their next courses. And what research there is suggests that that's probably way too optimistic. So if I really do want to see that happen, I need to have it built into the course, and students need to be evaluated on that and assessed on that. I think that's quite reasonable to put out there. So that's what I think about the interdisciplinary, the combinations. And one other thing that I think, just from working with faculty, what this often comes down to in the thinking skills realm is defining, what does that look like? What does that look like when we see it? So that we can give students those concrete targets. Patrick's point about, engaging the massive amount of cognitive and brain power we have, his point is well taken, but that isn't something we can, tell students to do. Nobody can consciously engage neural mechanisms. They have to do so through tasks and goals and activities that we lay out for them. So when we have the deep reflection on, all right, what does it mean to multithink? There's lots of great answers to that question, but we have to sit down, do the reflection, picture it for ourselves, and that way we can hold it up to students and lay out learning activities that have them actually doing that. So that's I think half the battle in something that's very ambitious, such as multithinking. But I would read the heck out of an article that was about multithinking. So I hope to see more work in that area.
Patrick, that's a note. Start publishing on this.
Publishing. Send it to me.
But this is interesting to think about how we have to model more and more of this. Do you know there's a wonderful scholar who studies computer games named Constance Steinkuhler. And she had this really, really interesting paper where she was looking at some high school students who were playing a computer game that involved a lot of math. I mean, it's a computer game that you have to have Excel running just to play the game at the basic level. But they were failing basic math in high school.
See?
And so she was trying to figure out this transfer problem. But that's my thought, not Patrick's thought. We have another question coming up. And by the way, friends, I'm firing off all these questions. We've got a bunch of them. But I think we're hitting a bunch of issues, so please feel free to surface your own questions for this extra. This is from Jessica Sullivan. And she said, Michelle just mentioned in her previous answer an area of cognitive research called interleaving or interweaving. Could she speak more to that? I haven't heard of that in my studies.
Oh, okay. And that's a wonderful question. So, I was just writing about this issue this morning, so it's pretty fresh in my mind. So a lot of the cognitive research turned into advice for teachers. That, the things that I've written and other people have written, a lot of that reflects and comes out of applied memory research, which is in no way to imply that memory, learning is all about memory. It's just one thing among many, but that is one area where we've made a lot of progress in kind of understanding theoretical principles, but also really practical ones, like things that actually you can see them play out in a real environment. So we hear a lot about, retrieval practice, the testing effect, how tests help memory. That's one big thing, but there are some others as well. Interleaving in particular is interesting to me as a disciplinary insider too, because it's one where we're still figuring out some things about the basics of how it works. So that's exciting, but that's also a big caveat. So, all right. So first of all, what do we mean by interleaving in this context? So interleaving is a principle that plays out not for everything, and that's a big thing to keep in mind. This is, I mean, things like the testing effect, that applies pretty much no matter what you're learning. Interleaving is a kind of a specialized one that applies to certain kinds of learning situations or certain kinds of topics. All right, so the two kind of arenas where it applies are, first of all, when you're learning distinctions among categories. And when I talk about this in a big group, I love to, have people throw up their hands and say, "Oh, for whom does this apply in your discipline?" So learning the distinctions among categories, especially a lot of the work has been on more perceptual categories, like in botany. I've seen this applied in botany, telling the difference between different sorts of plants, different bird species. Also things like telling artistic styles apart. If you think about it, that's a perceptual categorization task. And your mind kind of has to learn these category boundaries, and it has to do so by experience. So that's one area where interleaving applies. The other area where it applies is when we are, it's kind of similar. It's like when we're doing different problem types. And this one is, that's quite relatable to me as a statistics teacher. So if you do like applied statistics work, hey, there's different statistical tests, t-test, chi-square, and so on, that you'd use in different situations. And part of what you have to do as a student is learn, okay, when do I run a t-test, when do I do a chi-square, and so on, and breaking down different math problem approaches. So if you think about it, both of those learning situations involve your ability to kind of tell, take some new information, say, okay, is this an A or is it a B? Is it a C or is it a D? So categorization. Okay, so that said, interleaving is the principle that you're in general going to do better when you practice with a bunch of mixed up examples or a bunch of mixed up problem types. And I think this is important because, especially when we're teaching something like statistics, students are inclined to structure their study in a different way. And textbooks also do this as well. So they say, okay, we're going to talk about t-tests. We're going to practice t-tests until you've got that concept down. And here's when you use it. And then we move on, right? Mm-hmm. And students do that. If you think about it, it's quite intuitive. They don't get the practice in that component of it. They never have to say, oh, wait a minute, is this kind or that kind? So interleaving says mix it up. If I'm practicing discriminating a bunch of, among different plant types or different molecule types, artistic styles, a big kind of deck of practice examples that's very diverse is better, again, than the blocked ones. Mm. So, that's a pretty intuitive principle. But interleaving, like I said, we're still figuring some things out. It isn't just this one across the board. This applies pretty much no matter what principle, like retrieval practices. We're still learning that there may be some exceptions to this that have to do with really intricate little things like, how similar are examples to each other? How clear are the boundaries between concepts? It's fascinating research, but that's a big caveat for people who want to apply. So, first of all, figure out if it applies to you. And if not, don't worry about it. And second of all, be sure you have a pretty good conceptual understanding. You see, I've noticed when I just rattle this off to students, I've kind of learned it the hard way that they take this to mean, well, I should mix everything up in studying. I'll study math for 5 minutes. I'll study English for 5 minutes. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that is kind of up in the air, but that's not what interleaving truly is. So, it's one of those that everybody should know about it. We should have the basics of it, but it's a different sort of ball of wax than some of these other principles we talk about.
Oh, this is fascinating. There's Jessica, I'm so glad that you pounced on that. I mean, that's just a terrific question. There's a novel, I want to say it's from the 40s, by German writer Hermann Hesse, called Magister Ludi. Have you seen this novel? It's a strange one.
No, I want to see it now, though.
If everyone hasn't read it, it's long, so it's not the one people usually read. But it's about a future where people play a game called the glass bead game, and you have in the game you have thousands of beads. And each bead represents a point of knowledge from across the disciplines. And so it could be the lyric poem, it could be the benzene ring in chemistry, it could be the F flat in music. And what you do is you put one bead down and you play another bead, and you have to explain the connection between the two. And people spend years playing this game, making these elaborate patterns out of this way. It's just one of the extraordinary things. It seems like it'd be like the interleaving game.
Yeah, I'm surprised that nobody's implemented this. Maybe they have. I'm not a gamer, so I don't know, but that might
tried,
be a game.
but it's
oh, they tried, but it's just...
Well, maybe we still have time. Jessica, again, thank you for a great question. Michelle, what a terrific answer. We have a question from a mysterious person, because I have a little glitch in my text, and it just says S's avatar. So whoever S's avatar is, the question says, in the online environment, how can we leverage technology to enhance student buy-in in the course? In other words, how can we get students to actually read and watch the videos, resources we post? So that's a very practical question. How do we use what you've discovered, Michelle, to make students more engaged with online learning?
Oh, gosh. I think, and I'm going to give her just a really practical, non-theoretical answer here. I think a lot of it does come down to interactivity. Not to kind of plug one product over another too much, but the last time I put together an entire online course, we had good. I liked the use of VoiceThread, and there's probably different ways to replicate this functionality no matter what. And what's special about that is simply that it's just broken down in a very granular way that what you want students to comment on different slides of a presentation, which otherwise kind of just washes over students, and you don't know if they watched it, and maybe they watched it and they didn't pay attention. I think that there's that. And VoiceThread does make a kind of a big deal about, you can record voice comments, you can record text comments, I think you can do video comments. I don't know that is necessarily what sets us above, but that was my experience from using this. And specifically what students were doing is they're practicing different techniques from memory. And so it forced me to make the slides very interactive too. So instead of just saying, well, here's an overview of things you could do, instead I had to say, okay, here's a list of 10 words and here's what we're going to do with them. Now on the next slide, you weigh in and say what happened. So I think that so having students, really breaking it down in that way can get students to do it. Intermediate, it's a little bit more boring, but you can do retrieval practice, quiz questions, weigh in, even short answer questions. Even if you're not going to grade every single one, you can do that every time a chunk of material is presented. So I think passing the ball back and forth to students in that way and making it very explicit that this isn't like, come in and say something. This is like, this is where your points come from. That's a big part of it as well. So with some creativity, it can work. I think when there's accountability, we're very social creatures, and so of course when there's accountability in groups to each other, that helps. But obviously that itself does bring up, even in the easiest face-to-face environment, putting together functioning groups can be a challenge. So those are some things that we should look at. But yeah, I like the mindset that's kind of displayed by the question itself of kind of saying, well, what's happening on the other side of the monitor, so to speak, as the person is going through this. So that focus on the student and the activity and the cognition instead of the material and the content is I think, a big framework that can only help us.
If I can just build on that for one quick second, and then we have a video question. So Christopher, if you want to bring Roxanne up, are you talking about doing both a kind of constructivist pedagogy at the same time as doing a kind of formative assessment as part of this way of getting students to interact?
Okay. And that's directed to me or to Roxanne?
To you, yes.
Okay. I think you could describe it as constructivist, pretty loosely, not in the sense that I need for you to discover and put together the material on your own, but that it is a two-way dialogue. And I'm a little bit old school too with sometimes when we're teaching. There's times when just very open-ended reflection can be counterproductive. I'm just going to say that because I teach psychology, and especially at an introductory level, if I just say to students, "Oh, okay, do you think dreams predict the future? Reflect on it." I mean, I think that they could go to a critical thinking place and conclude the same things I wouldn't, but they may not, and then they're kind of rehearsing incorrect information. So we really also have to think about the misconceptions that students are going to come to the course with. And yes, they don't correct those or change them just because we say that's wrong. In fact, that probably won't help. But they may also not be able to correct them if they simply just sort of run with an idea the way they want to. So yeah, I'm not an expert on constructivist pedagogy, but that's that's how I would kind of bounce that notion back. It's good reflection. It's what we have to ask, especially when we're going into a relatively new thing like fully online teaching.
Thank you. That's really good. And I should step out of the way because Roxanne Riskin is here. Roxanne is a wonderful learning designer, a longtime friend of the forum, and I'm just delighted that she can be here.
Hi, Doc. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Brian and Dr. Miller. Thank you so much. And I just want to show, yes, it's arrived.
Yes.
I'm here. And I think every instructional designer and teacher should have a copy of this from K through higher ed. It's actually, I'm in chapter 1 right now, and it's an excellent resource. So thank you for your research, as well as our micro Twitter conversation we had last week on looking at cognitive overload in 360 and VR experiences for students. And can you talk a little bit about that in the cognitive area on when we create these experiences? How are we going to measure whether or not we're giving students too much or not enough? And how are we going to measure effective teaching and learning experiences in this new learning media?
Right. And this is very much on my mind. We are literally just at the launch phase of a big new iteration of a VR project here. And yeah, you realize pretty quick that it's a different medium, and not just because of all the bells and whistles and the cool factor. There's just the practical stuff of like, okay, you can only really be in VR for 20 minutes. That's kind of the best practice standard. So everything has to, fit in a new time window. You have to think about people's physical safety, accessibility, and universal design. Oh my gosh, that's going to be a huge issue going forward. So there's so much to be kind of sorted out. And yeah, what do we use for measurement? There's one of my favorite articles in this area is that Richard Mayer article, which is kind of a head-to-head comparison of a PowerPoint and a VR experience. And I believe, I'm thinking back in this article, they went with a very kind of conventional retention measure. And if that's the goal of the experience, then that's what the measure should reflect. I think that there's going to be a real tension as well, and it's not a bad thing, but we have had a lot of spirited discussions already in my research group about student engagement, and I liked it. It was fun, it was cool, and what I learned and got out of it. And then furthermore, what I learned and got out of it can be subdivided into the student's perception and performance or retention measures. So that's a lot. It's a lot to tackle. And I think that it's also going to need to be disciplinary specific. I would love to see this field, and I hope that our work in part does this. I would love to see the field be able to say some things about VR learning that apply no matter what. I do, but there are so many different ways to go about this, and I think it does look different. I mean, we have, for example, in the healthcare field, you've got VR experiences where people are immersed in a videotape emergency room environment, and that's great for what they want to do. We have students manipulating these representations of molecules with chemical bonds. And, you can shrink them and load them up. They're kind of beach ball size to start with, but they could be whatever. That's very, very different. So, yeah, I think that people are really going to have to be in a phase of designing their own assessments that are really closely mapped onto the objectives for these things. And one last reason for having to do that is, boy, once you get into this, you realize it's not something you can just put together. I mean, I think we all kind of intellectually know that, but until you start working with VR designers, it's like, oh, well, we're going to program this for 2 months, and then maybe we'll have a pilot test of it. I mean, it's a lot of work. So you really have to, you can't go into it just with like, let's do this, explore this, and it'll be fun. You really have to say, we want students to have a better ability to visualize and manipulate and accurately, work with organic chemistry molecules. That's what we, for example, that's what we're trying to do. And so part of the assessment of that is the same assessments that they have in the course. But we are also going to be looking at kind of self-perceived usefulness and I guess, for lack of a better term, liking of the experience. We've kind of, our measures, such as they are right now, kind of gone along those two tracks. And in our pilot work anyway, with just a few students, we found that there was maybe some separation between, between students. For example, along lines of gender, along lines of whether they are heavy gamer. They may say different things about what they're like. And now that we're going to map it onto their course performance, we may find yet a third thing. So, yeah, these are the issues we're going to need to grapple with. Who's to say if it's effective? Impact on the course, impact on, hey, I found this really enjoyable, impact on, I think it really helped me in a way that a traditional teacher would. So, yeah, long answer, but this is really on my mind. What do you think, Gretchen?
I agree with everything, and I think as we begin to design these experiences, we can't design them alone. We need researchers, we need instructional designers, we need the subject matter experts. We just need a team of people looking at the best ways of presenting these scenarios, whether they're in simulations in nursing or in multi-user VR, 360 VR experiences, which is probably the newest thing that's being looked at right now, a multi-user learning experience. So it's such a new field. It's exciting to be looking at this and being able, I've been an educator for over 30 years. So it's something that in the non-digital area and just exploring being digital and having those perspectives, it's important to bring in these new learning technologies and not be dismissive, but being able to explore them with an open mind. And as they develop, I think they're incubating right now.
Yeah, aren't they? I mean, this has just taken off in the last few years. I remember it was just a few years ago, I visited the first school that had, thanks to the Shell Oil Company underwriting them, they had an actual immersive VR lab. Now, everywhere I go, everybody's got a project. And so it's going to be really neat to see that work play out. But yeah, it is. And it's funny how we have a little bit of that narrative, I think, that's left over from, the MOOC mania and what have you of, oh, this is going to replace things. And I've had people ask me, is this going to replace faculty? Right. I just think, I don't think you've seen these things. They're a wonderful adjunct. Our project may replace ball and stick models. Students definitely like them better than ball and stick models in OChem. But no, it's not the sort of thing where I put on a headset and I sit in a lecture for an hour. That's not where this is going. So I'm kind of giggling a little, watching it all play out. But yeah, you're right. It's at a really exciting stage.
I jumped ahead in your book, and you had mentioned somewhere, I don't know, I don't read linear. Sometimes I just jump around, start at the end first. That you mentioned sometimes experience, even looking at an image, will invoke a feeling of peacefulness or calmness. So just looking at the media that we currently have, just using those as adjuncts, like you say, or extra experiences to provide students with learning in those multi-dimensional, those multi kind of case scenarios of looking at different ways of presenting the same material, video, audio, and now immersive.
And now immersive as being one powerful tool we're going to have to play on. Yeah, and it wasn't. I mean, it's not part of Minds Online. Not really. I don't think I remember talking about it at all. It was not really part of the scene. I mean, a lot of us knew in theory that it could be, but it just didn't happen yet.
It's wonderful. So thank you again, and I'm looking forward to promoting your book because it's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roxanne. I really appreciate you taking my time. And please say hi to your puppy for me when you can. She's a very sweet dog. And Michelle, thank you so much for engaging. This is just great. We have a couple of questions left. Do you still have time?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, good. Oh, good. This is a question about the competition. That's from Ray Garcelon, who's a great friend of the program. And he says, is there a book or are there books from the last 1 or 2 years that you think most confirms or complements your Minds Online book?
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. So, kind of thinking about this. Well, you know, I'm always a fan of James Lang's work, and he's been hard at work actually in the last year or so on the issue of distracted students. And as he'll be the first to tell you, he's not from cognitive science, but he's an English professor. But he really does a great job of collecting and parsing a lot of the science, and really is very scrupulous about having this evidence base. So, Small Teaching came out a couple years ago. Not technology per se, but just like with a lot of things, some of his techniques work better when they have some technology to make them doable. So Small Teaching is a good recommendation, I think. There is a fourth, I think it's still forthcoming, book by Josh Eiler. And I believe it's called The Story of Learning. And you spell his name Eyler. He's at Rice University, and is a very dynamic, up and coming young person in the field of faculty professional development and teaching and learning. So that's one too, where a person from the humanities, and I believe he's a historian, he, integrates and puts together his very good interpretation of a great deal of science. In this case, not just cognitive science, but also evolutionary science, brain science, a bunch of things like that. So that's a good one. Flipped Learning by Robert Talbert. That one has more of a technology focus, but I was really impressed by the quality of it and how it's kind of nice because he, if I remember right, really gets into the study of like, well, isn't flipped learning where you put everything on video and walk away? And, sometimes, people, they'll want to have a flipped learning thing. They'll sell that to their upper administration. The administration says, oh, right, that's where you video stuff. And he takes it on of like, no, it's not synonymous with video. Here's how it works. So he's a mathematician. And so that's his perspective. So those three, going a little bit further afield, I think Moonwalking with Einstein, he's a journalist and he gets a lot of the science right too. And that's more about memory and less about learning, but it's a great story combined with a lot of great applied cognitive sciences as well. So those are some of the ones that, kind of off the top, I would say are definitely worth a read and probably a good companion read to Minds Online if you did like that.
Wow, what a great syllabus. I think we should teach a class with that. And thank you for adding all of this. Ray, what a great question. We have the last 4 questions coming up. And the first one comes from Jessica. Oh, excuse me for 1 second. We had a question here from Mike Welker. I just missed that. Mike asks, my standard bromide for bump... Whoop, Christopher, if you can bring that back up, please.
Yeah.
Just saw it for a second. Let me bring up Mike's question. Okay, my standard bromide for bumping up student engagement is reworking learning tasks or assessment to be embedded within a context, project-based learning, etc. Is there cognitive research to mine on this?
Well, let's see. There's, I think, a fair amount on, problem-based learning per se, which may not be exactly addressing what you're asking, but in a way, it's not so much one article or even one thinker, one theory, but what it brings up to me is what I see as a trend over the last 30 or so years of cognitive research, which is, marching towards, marching away from the idea that our minds are these collections of, kind of mechanical pieces that handle a task, or that where we put information, this assembly line, mechanistic idea of thinking. And time and again, we've seen theories be revised to talk more about, to have more of what we would call a functionalist approach, not just like, okay, here's the piece of your mind that does problem solving, but more, why does problem solving work the way it does? You're in your environment. Ultimately, you as an organism want to survive. That's sort of the goal of this whole thing. How do you use cognitive capacities in a way that lets you do that? And I think that sort of, cognition, thinking, memory, all these things that are situated very much in things we're doing right now. That's, I think, in the spirit of problem-based learning. The mind just doesn't do stuff in isolation. The mind is pretty ruthlessly efficient. I know from memory, we remember things because we have to, not because we want to, or because we say, oh, I'll need this in a year, I think, It's sort of in the here and now what tells me that this is really vital, and that's what I'm going to spend my capacity on. And so I think it's a very short leap to say from that, yeah, and problem solving too, you're talking about this effortful, attentive processing that's just sucking up all your resources when you're solving a problem. Why would you do that if there weren't, at least some immediate goal or solution you could do? Now, in problem-based learning, we are asking students to project themselves into scenarios. It's not like they actually have a problem sometimes that they are dealing with, unless it's like an action research project or something like that. But that said, people also, fortunately, have a pretty well-developed capacity to project themselves into scenarios and to treat scenarios as if they are realistic and real problems. So we can take advantage of that, people's ability to kind of, play act in a way and give them authentic problems to solve. So I think it fits with this big functionalist framework and how cognitive science is going. But yeah, I'd have to look more to say, is there, something you can point to say, here is what PBL will do, and here's why it does it.
That's a good answer. A really rich answer for a deep probe of a question. Thank you so much, Mike. Please.
Oh, and it's important because these are labor-saving things. I think, working in the area as I do also of, course redesign, and especially in these foundational courses, they almost seem to revert over time. They will inexorably revert to, well, let's give them some tests and some things to read. It is hard. It is difficult. And Jim Lang talks a lot about this in Small Teaching. It is hard to put together these big, ambitious projects for role-playing and problem-solving. So, while there may not be a pat answer, at least not one I can give today, you have to have something to keep you motivated to do this, whether it's continuing to ask for the resources from one's leadership or just personally to say, oh my gosh, I have to reset this whole activity this semester. Why am I doing this? We have to remind ourselves that is where the payoff is. And yes, the pressure will always be to give students something more superficial. And we have to press forward to give them things that are more challenging and more authentic.
Well, speaking of challenging and authentic, we're going to run out of time, and we have some more questions to cover. This is great. Michelle, this is like a wonderful seminar here.
Touched on last time.
Okay, if another one sounds like it has a dreamlike function of repetition, then we can skip it. We had a question from John Gould, and I'm going to have to read this. This is like a meditation for him. He asked, she wants to know what you see in the emerging field of AI and its impact on teaching and learning from a cognitive scientist point of view. He mentions listening to Conrad Wolfman, Rethinking the Teaching of Math. That Wolfman asks that we should move away from teaching math to teaching computational thinking. He asks if you know Wolfram Alpha and computational algorithms. And he thinks that comes back to a point that we made today, that we live in highly disciplined silos in higher education. What's interesting about Wolfram Alpha and Mathematica is that they're using AI as a way of overcoming these silos. So how do you think AI can help teaching and learning from this cognitive science point of view?
Right. When I'm looking at this, the place that my mind goes is towards adaptive courseware. And that's something that, we've talked about adaptive courseware a long time in educational technology, and I think we're trying to have a renaissance of it right now. Systems where individual students can go in and get either tasks or material that's really calibrated to where they're at, not just in terms of difficulty, but in terms of the content. I've had people describe to me systems that would use something like what Amazon and Netflix use to just determine what happens next in the student's learning environment. That said, I'm so cautious about, I don't know if skeptical is the right word, and I'm not skeptical of the promise of it. I'm skeptical about what needs to happen in order to build systems like that. I think kind of a little bit like with VR, it's easy for somebody to kind of skate by this and go, oh my gosh, the next thing we'll just have AI and learning, it'll be fine. To do that, you have to lay an enormous amount of groundwork about how people think in an area. A lot of this groundwork has been done in mathematics. We have a pretty good idea of how mathematical concepts develop and how to assess them, how to know what they are. But what about history? What about research methods? That's what I teach. What do we really know about the development of the thinking skills in that? We can talk about it, but do we have the data? We could get the data, but that would take a lot of work. And until that work goes in, we cannot simply build a system to take advantage of that. And, there was an article that came out a couple of years ago by Candace Teal, who's a massive leader in this area, in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. And it was not encouraging. If you really read it, you went, oh, wow, that's scary. She pointed out that when these are proprietary systems, you also don't know, and you can't even look at that underlying whatever it is. So that's going to be a big issue. So let's see it as an area to dig into, to develop the knowledge, and then to build the systems. But especially outside of mathematics, that's a pretty long way off. I mean, you can have a system that looks very sophisticated and maybe using AI, but if it's just kind of giving you multiple choice questions that the professor had to sit down and write the night before, that's not, I think, what we really have in mind when we have these very ambitious ideas. What do you think of that?
Myself, I'm finishing a chapter on AI for my new book. And I share a lot of the skepticism, and I share a lot of the optimism. I mean, the dream is a kind of killer combination of formative assessment and constructivist pedagogy that can really adapt to learners in a deep way, that can connect learners to massively mapped out curriculum. And I think there's huge potential for that. And we've seen hints of it in things like language learning app Duolingo. And I think we also saw some hints of that as well in some earlier projects. But there are a lot of obstacles, and you mentioned some of the huge ones. I mean, if they're proprietary and closed, we can't get into them. And sometimes the programmers don't know what's going on. If you look at generative algorithms, for example, which compete with each other, they rapidly exceed our ability to follow them. And also, of course, all the problems with big data analytics. I mean, can we? What happens to the data that's gathered? Recapitulates social prejudices and biases. What happens when these are used as tools of control? I think there are a lot of risks, but the dream. I mean, do you know the science fiction story by Neil Stephenson, the Young Ladies Illustrated primer?
I do not.
This is a weird recommendation. He's a very famous science fiction novelist. He's very interesting. But he has this novel called The Diamond Age, and The Diamond Age, most of it I think is unremarkable, but in it there's a kind of novella that runs through the novel. And it's the story of a bunch of orphans in China who are given an ebook called The Young Ladies Illustrated Primer, and the ebook teaches them in ways that we are still trying to figure out how to do today. I don't want to spoil it for you because it's a fantastic little story. So just grab a copy of The Diamond Age, skip the rest, just read the primer. You'll be able to do that, and see where that goes. I think that's the dream people have of ebooks. But thank you for asking. I want to make sure that we have time for one last question, and this is a killer question because this is a pragmatic question. This is from Clark Shaw Nelson, and Clark asks, what are a few top tips for cognitively optimizing online courses, especially at the grad school level? So in the past 2 hours, last session and this session, you've covered a lot of ground, Michelle, and I'm just wondering, are there any other practical tips that you'd like to leave us with? I mean, anything from time on task minutes to the classic idea of how many items on a PowerPoint slide, or is there anything else that you want us to make sure that we have in our toolbox?
Oh, wow. I think students, even at the graduate level, are hungry for opportunities to practice. I walked in on my class where I was giving an exam yesterday, and this little, it's called Kahoot. It's a little quizzing thing. Yeah. I walked in and they were running that on their own. I had just kind of pasted the link someplace, and they had their phones out and they were playing it. I had nothing to do with that. So, anything that gives in a very interactive way, students the opportunity to practice, whether it's knowledge or skills too. And even if they don't get a ton of feedback, if they get something back for that, I think that's really, really important. I think we can also borrow from the face-to-face environment and say a top tip is, if you're struggling with how do I put together X, Y, and Z, I have no time, hand it back to students, especially at the graduate level. That was a big breakthrough for me when I said, okay, instead of collecting 10 videos on good lecture techniques, you collect them and put them up, and then we'll have a way to comment on them. And students, bear in mind that that's a familiar thing for them. So figuring out ways that they can put together the media, the content, even the activities. At the graduate level, having them say, how would you teach this? That works face-to-face. I think that can work online as well. I think pushing ourselves to offer variable media, that's always a top tip. And it's a scary one because we don't want to imply that, it's because of learning styles. And, hopefully folks have kind of understood that that's debunked. It's not that we have to have visuals over here for the visual people and so forth. But
people
that helps. Oh my gosh. But that forces us, as the designer of the learning experience, I know this myself, it forces me to say, all right, what are the different ways that people can engage in content? Have I not just rewritten the textbook online, or said, here's 5 TED Talks and, I've done my job? So really thinking about the different things that people can do. Discussion forums are great, and they can be great, especially at a graduate level, to just, say, okay, talk about this article or this reaction to this literature.
Right.
That's fine, but you can also use them to talk about an activity. You can also use them to say, hey, I want you to try this, and then come back in the forum and say what happened. So I hate to just say creativity and out of the box thinking, but it really does help. And in as much as things like, quality rubrics or checklists or things like that help, I think that's how they do it, is they make us think, all right, what else could I put into this experience that could make it diverse and rich and interactive?
That's a fantastic, fantastic answer. And I think this shows you as both a terrific person for professional development as well as as a great teacher yourself. Your passion for learning really comes off. Michelle, we've shot through the hour with incredible speed, and we have actually exhausted all the questions. I think it's a testimony to the richness and power of your thinking that we need 2 hours to cover just a first pass at that. Let me thank you so much for all of your time, for all of your generous answers. And on behalf of the Future Transform, let me just congratulate you on your work. This is so vital for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And please stay in touch, everybody. I love this stuff. So,
what's the best way to stay in touch with you? What's the best way to keep up with you?
Well, let's see. Getting in touch with me on Twitter, I think is great, especially if it's a quick message. I do have a Facebook presence as well. If you want to read more stuff of mine or read different reviews of my book and so on, my website michellemillerphd.com is a good place to grab that. Facebook, Twitter, and email. If it's a longer thing, feel free to email me at Northern Arizona University.
Fantastic. And your Twitter handle is MDMillerPhD, right?
That's right.
Excellent. Well, thanks again so much. Everybody, thanks for participating in the very first ever Future Transform Extra. We'll see you next week. And thanks again, everybody. Have a great time. Bye-bye.